Good afternoon, Jamie.
Hi, David. So great to be joined with you again. So everyone watching, I was joined recently by David. We did an interview together where he spoke through and gave us some information on how to effectively wake up our friends and family. It was an incredible interview. So if you haven't seen it already, check it out. I'll put the link in the description. But today, David's come back with some, I guess, kind of scary information, but also extremely empowering information, as always. And if you're not familiar with David's work, check it out as well, because he's doing some incredible things. And it really is an honor to be helping to reach a wider audience with David's work. He's really helping all of us activists with some extremely empowering information. So David, yeah, hit us, man. What have you got to talk about today?
Hi, Jamie. Thank you. Yes, the previous interview we did was very useful to get the how to really the do's and don'ts within a conversation. That was a very important video, and that's been watched by a lot of people now. We had some good feedback on that. And one element that I think is really important, and we've titled it today, The Marketing of a Problem. And it's really to look into really today with an overview to look at all the different types of propaganda and influence that's affecting us. And once we see even just the acknowledgement that it exists, I think is very important. Some people refer to there being an information war going on. I don't like the term war because that implies that we have enemies, and most people are not enemies. They're actually on our side. There's very few people that are intentionally doing some bad things, and they do exist. I like to look at it as though once we reach each other, realize we're on the same side, then things really, a lot of the solutions present themselves. Now, in that respect, what's happened is a lot of people have had their perceptions altered to believe certain things that might or might not be true. And the question that we're going to address today is the how. How has that managed to occur? How are people really, with a lot of the time, good intentions, doing things that might not be positive? Does that make sense? So it's really looking a little bit under the surface. Obviously, there's so much content in this subject. So we're going to have really an overview today. And we're going to look at some of the, what we class the models, which really is just a collection of information, presented to see how a group of people can really, if they understand how our perception works, and they can present us information in a certain slant or angle that will have us doing behaviors that might not be in our best interest, then that is obviously very important.
Yeah, cool. I mean, I'm really fascinated to find out how deep this goes, to be honest, because we all know we're manipulated and brainwashed by media and stuff and films, but it sounds like it goes a lot deeper than most of us realize.
Yeah, it goes really deep. I mean, my skills really are to take bodies of work and really summarize them. That's where I used to do a lot of consulting, and that's what I'm going to do today. So any one of these topics, you'll find a number of people that will know it in a lot more depth. However, just having the knowledge of it's really key. And then, we go into deeper examples on each of these models in videos that we have on the website. And once you go into the examples and you have really a knowledge of how a particular influence factor will work, then you're in some way protected from it, because you know that people are trying to influence you by using certain buzzwords or phrasing or structure. And it also allows that a lot of them are actually quite ethical ways. For instance, we were talking about stories and how effective they are in conveying information, and things like that obviously are very ethical. And I think it's really, I think we've got a note in the presentation, but I think so much of this really depends on your intention. If you have a good intention to affect people positively, then that's going to hopefully turn out positive. It's really when, and of course we chatted about this information is so powerful, and if it gets into the wrong hands, it could be, well, it's in the wrong hands. We know that there's people have been marketing to us for decades, in detriment to the earth, the planet, the resources, in order for us to buy things that throw away. That's not in line with our true nature. Shall we get going? I have a presentation slide deck, and a lot of this, we're trying to get the information out as quick as we can. And in order to do that, we obviously can't have lots of bells and whistles, but hopefully it'll be visually stimulating enough to understand the key concepts. So what I'll do is I'll share the presentation, we'll talk through it, and obviously feel free, Jamie, if something's not really crystal clear or even, you know, to the point of having a comprehension, then you can ask questions. How does that sound?
We'll bring it on.
Awesome. Let's get to it. We've titled this The Marketing of a Problem, How People Are Influenced. We all know we're influenced to one degree or another, but what is fascinating is that people don't know just how influenced we are. And it was really funny. One of the people that I trained with, a guy called Ian McDermott, he made a comment once around communication, which said he is amazed that anyone communicates at all, knowing what he knows about the brain and perception. And it's really fascinating when we understand, you know, how perception works and just the real multi-layers to it. And most people watching this will only need an overview to really start to get some very useful knowledge. So what is the purpose of this presentation? So we're going to look at the various factors, these are the influence factors, that are used to alter perception in order to create the circumstances we're in today. And a lot of these have been known for a long time. Some of them go back thousands of years, and we will see that, you know, how people can influence another. Now, influencing people can be a very positive thing. So some of the great leaders in the past and some of the, you know, civil rights leaders, etc., they influenced people in a very positive way. They gave people a vision, something people could inspire to. And I think mainly because their intention was of a noble nature. If this intention that someone has to influence another is not in their best interest, that's when we start to get a lot of problems. So today we're going to look at the how those pushing various agendas have managed to do it. Because it's quite startling when you look at how people really have changed a lot of their perceptions in a short space of time. And really, my whole point is really just to bring this into your awareness, into everyone that's watching this awareness, so they know it exists. If you're playing a game of chess and you've only know that pawns exist, you're not really going to have much of a chance against somebody that's using the whole board. So a lot of this is really a lot of the groups, I think this could be very useful for, because they could understand how to deliver a message much more effectively. This is going to be an overview because the content, there's just a vast amount of content on this subject. We've already made a number of videos on it and looking for this interview to really form an overview. And as we just mentioned, this will allow us to have access to pieces on the chessboard in order to develop strategies to counter, and I think most importantly, to call out the game. Once, if we know we're being manipulated or coerced and we literally just call it out, those doing the manipulation, you know, they will have second thoughts, hopefully. And of course, this is fresh off the press. There may be some typos. We really don't have the luxury of, you know, sitting down and really working this through. I work a lot of this with a small group of people that assist me. You know, we don't have access to many resources. So a lot of this is really just our, you know, our ingenuity in trying to get this out there. And really, this work can help combat propaganda and be more effective in getting our message across. I think that's one of the key things. So just a few notes. Really, the examples used are merely examples, and it's up to the viewer to determine if they feel these are ethical use of the work. It's really, you know, a lot of the time, if we have good intentions and we have good ethics, then we really don't have to worry about being very powerful, influential. It would be natural. But this is something that everyone has to ask themselves. And I think that's one of the really important questions. So the problem a lot that I see is that people are outsourcing their authority to others to make the decision. And that's when that continues on a global scale, then you have a very few people influencing a large number of people. And obviously power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So we're going to look at many of the influence factors, and some will be natural and advised to be used, and others, you know, there's going to be a gray area that you really have to ask yourself and really tune into if it's ethical. The ethical question that arises is that we need to make sure we package truth to be seen and be careful not to manipulate. So I think what a lot of these techniques have been used for in a bad way is that the information that's being packaged, it's very questionable whether it's actually true or not. And that, I think that's really a key aspect to it. So one good example of ethical use of influence factors is to share stories. Jerome Bruner showed, and he was a cognitive psychologist, I believe in the 60s, and he showed that if you wrapped a fact in a story, is 22 times more powerful than just the plain fact at landing. And it tends to bypass resistance. And there is some debate here whether it's only 6 or 7 times as more powerful. But I mean, think about that. It's really not an argument if it's 600% more powerful or 2200% more powerful. The point is that it's a lot more powerful than just throwing facts at someone. I find that when I wrap the facts in the story wants to be factual, you can use, fables at times, as long as the person knows that it's a fable. But stories, really true stories, have a very powerful effect. And that's when you'll see the media, they will pick onto like one example of something and then just push that rightly onto us without giving us the real, that it's not, a generalization that's true, if it's just one example. And that's when the story becomes very powerful, because people then tend to believe, base their belief systems on that. In order to really explain how these influence factors work, I think first we need to take a look at perception and how that operates. And we're only going to have a very brief overview of this, because even this subject alone is many people's life work. So as T.S. Eliot said, people exercise an unconscious selection in being influenced. And this really, I think he's referring to how a lot of the time information we're exposed to is influence us at an unconscious level that a lot of the time, we're not really aware of. It's just our unconscious is choosing these things. And that's why it's very important. So let's look at one of our examples we use a lot is Jane blogs. And then Jane blogs is obviously exposed to reality on a daily basis. However, it's widely known in the psychology community, we don't operate with reality directly. It's actually impossible to do so because there's too much information. Where at any one moment, we're bombarded with billions of pieces of information. And of course, we have to run a lot of that through our mind, and we have to work out through our memories and what things mean. So the brain really operates on what we call the map is not the territory. And it's really, we map out, we have our perception is how we see the world. So one of the really good metaphors that's used is the map is not the territory. So the map itself isn't reality, but it's how you navigate reality. So if you move somewhere new, you're going to, learn all the streets, etc. And then as you're learning that, you're building your map. You build maps of everything. So we've got maps on maps on maps. Another good metaphor, and I'll use a couple of them so you can choose which one really you like. So it's the menu. So when we're reading the menu at a restaurant, that menu is a description of the food. It's not the food itself. If you ate the menu, you'd find out very quickly that the menu is not very nutritious. The menu is a description about what's going on. So our perceptions are so often a description about what's going on. Another good metaphor is the GPS system. If the GPS has incorrect settings or the roads are not mapped correctly, then it's not going to be very useful. And this is the key point. Maps are neither right or wrong. They are either useful or not useful. Okay. And there'll be times when it can have really devastating consequences if the information in the map is not reflecting reality accurately. So of course the question comes up, how are maps built? So primarily as we evolved, it was really always by experience. We would experience things in the world. We would, realize very quickly the tiger may be dangerous, all these kind of things. As we evolved, we learned that it wasn't always the best way to learn by experience. So we learned to tell stories, and data we present, or presented with. So if you look at all cultures around the globe, they will have stories in their culture. And this is how one generation passed on information down to the next generation. It was via stories. So the brain is literally structured to take in information via stories. Here's where the problem begins. If the information in those stories is not strictly accurate or is serving another purpose than actually exposing us to information that we need, that's where we get the problem. Because since most people now are exposed, their perception is altered not by reality itself, but by media, stories, etc. Who controls those, that output of information is very important. And this is why Plato said, he who tells the stories rule society. Okay, and it's no secret that very powerful people have bought up all the media. Pretty much 99% of the media on the planet is controlled by 5 companies now. That is a lot of power. Yeah.
6 last time I had. Wow.
Yeah, well, I think they merged now. I mean, it could be 6, but I mean, the point is very key, because it's a lot of power in a very few hands. So this really is our perception. How does our perception operate is a really deep question, but hopefully this metaphor will be enough for the rest of the presentation to really show you how powerful this information is. And of course, we can't really talk about this without talking about what the BIT are. So the BIT is what's known as the Behavioral Insights Team. It's a group of psychologists. They have them in nearly every government, I think probably every government around the globe now. And their role is to basically use all the information in how to influence people and use it to get the public to follow public policy. Now in England, we have a team in Whitehall, and they have advanced knowledge of how perception works. And I think probably more importantly, how to alter it, which then gets onto that scary question is, if someone's influencing me without my consent, is that a problem? My opinion, yes, but it's for each viewer to decide for themselves. And of course, there's a very interesting story that I tell people to really illustrate how what we map, whether it be metaphorically in our mind or literally the maps that we build in the world, are so important. I worked many years ago. I worked in aviation claims, and one of the brokers told me a story, and I have no reason to believe it's not true, of this plane one evening had flown into the side of a mountain. It was a real disaster. They closed all the airport, investigation. They couldn't find what had happened. So they reopened the airport, and then a second plane flies into the side of this mountain. Massive investigations. And as it turned out, what had happened was they'd had new maps printed, and someone had missed a 0 off one of the heights of a mountain, which literally had devastating consequences. So since we don't interact with reality for the most part, how maps, both in our mind and the ones that we build, are really essential that they're accurate, or at least useful. That makes sense? Can we see how important that is? So really perception is the key, and anyone knows this. In companies, a lot of the time people are portraying that they do a good job because they feel that's more important than actually doing a good job. I'm not a fan of that kind of way of thinking, but perception is key. Reality is reality, but perceptions change and can be altered by outside forces. So really, a lot of the time it's conditioned to meet agendas, and that's when we have the problem, I do believe. I think there's one really important thing, and I think this in itself warrants further investigation and presentations, and that's really the perception of ourselves. So obviously we've got these, but if we turned it inwards and we said, okay, what is the mirror that we're seeing of ourselves? How do we see ourselves? And of course, people may think, well, that's the ego. And yes, to a certain degree it is. And we look at this in a bit more detail in some other videos. And how we see ourselves, we would refer to as our identity. Our belief systems is, what we believe to be in the world. But that ID, that top level of that, how we see ourselves, is so important, because this really drives so many other things. It drives our belief systems, our capabilities, our behavior, where and when we find ourselves. And what we find is that a number of people, psychologists, and I know that Matthias Desmet was looking at this and did some incredible work, is that you then start to look at the group identities. And you'll find that group identities will often override a personal identity. And that's when we start getting that groupthink. That's not bad necessarily in itself, is that we naturally form parts of groups. But if that group changes its output and outcomes without us being aware, and then we're following something that we believed in that's not going the way we think it's going, that's when problems occur. That makes sense? So I think this is a very deep subject, but I think it's just to make us aware. Because if someone says they're not confident, that's how they see themselves, okay? That's what they believe about themselves. But where did that come from? Because when you're 5, you literally run into a room, wearing a Batman t-shirt going, look at me, we don't have these things when we're born. So we literally have these conditioned into us, both naturally and artificially. Yeah, it's really our environment dictates a lot of this. You'll find that a lot of belief systems from generation to generation tend to carry, as do with cultures and other things. Now, that's a very deep and big subject, but I think it's worth pointing out that when people realize that, so a lot of people I've heard, oh, you know, I can't make a difference and all that. Well, that's only a belief. That's not true. Everyone can make a difference, no matter how small or large it is. It's huge, this whole subject.
Is that one of the reasons they often use labels to put us into groups? Like, for example, you know, anti-vaxxers being chucked around a lot, and then suddenly, if you're in that group of people, then you kind of believe the same as everyone else in that group.
Well, that's a really key question. I'm glad you asked that. And see, here's the thing. When you listen to the language, and I will say this goes so much depth, so I think we'll just touch on it now. When someone says, I am XXX, that's not strictly true. Yeah, you know, you'll hear some of the spiritual texts say, I am. That's it. Everything else is really a belief, or how you see yourself, skill sets, you know, skill sets, all those things. So the interesting thing you mentioned that is when people do operate from I am this and you are that, then there's separation. And if those separations are in opposition, it doesn't matter, because they're not going to listen to each other. And they said that's when they define these two boxes, is really, and that's via propaganda, that's the rule of simplification. You design things to be very simple so people can orientate themselves. The problem with that is that when they are defined by those terms, then if something comes along, let's say someone produced something that was very safe and effective and natural and all that, and it fell into one of those categories, would you dismiss it because you're anti that? That makes sense. So it's for us to be, and I know that people, that will trigger a lot of people, because, you know, a lot of people are fighting against things. And I understand that. And I've had some people really react to this, but say, look, we've got to see that we are, who we are is huge and powerful. And the things after that are really beliefs and other things. That makes sense. So yeah, it's really important not to step into those boxes. So then we can both step out of those boxes, both realize that we're, you know, whatever we are, human beings, etc., that we then can have a conversation from that point without that separation, without that disfiguration that's going on.
I think that's been one of the most powerful forms of, you know, by putting us into boxes and separating us. I've noticed that when people are identifying with something, logic goes out of the window completely.
Yes, absolutely, because you get the group mentality that comes on. You've got the, you know, as Le Bon with the, you know, the madness of crowds, etc. And that's where it's really important. I mean, we also want to run some sessions on logic and building up of logical arguments, because the point you made is very important. You know, once these groups are defined, and it really is the classic divide and conquer. You take a group of people, you put them into two separate boxes, you define the boxes as being opposition, and you just let them fight. It's crazy. And this is why one of the most important things we do is not to step in the ring. You know, okay.
Easy, yeah.
Yeah. So what's really interesting, that when we think about it, if you say I am this, I am that, that's really only a perception. And what I advocate is stepping out of that game. Yeah, step out of that game, know who's the enemy and who's not the enemy. And there's people that are appearing as their enemy because they're abusing us if we have certain views. But to really get through to them, we have to get them to see that we're not the enemy. In order to do that, we have to not step in that box. So if we're looking at perception, and then we're going to look at now some of these influence factors. Well, actually, these we're going to look at the models, and within the models, there have a number of influence factors. So one of the models is actually Mindspace. Now, this is a lot of people, if they start to read through this document, it's a government document which really is for their government departments to know how to get people to comply. That's really its intention, to get to change behavior through public policy. Now, obviously, it's up for the viewer to discern if that's an ethical use of their time, well, our time and money, to actually continue to follow things. Then we've got the 7 laws of influence. It's a very powerful work. The gentleman that this comes from, Roberto Cialdini, I personally know a friend of mine who's met him and worked with him a little bit, and he said he's actually a nice guy. He's got good ethics. So a lot of the origins of this information are actually from good, well-meaning people. So a lot of these things are actually good, powerful tools, but like any tool, whether it be a garden tool or a hammer or thing, used for the wrong purpose is when it has its problem. We've got very powerful language models that are quite important. We've got this thing known as NLP, which is neuro-linguistic programming. Now, in itself, there is thousands of people, NLP practitioners, that are wonderful people. They are using this to help people heal, to get more powerful, to bring their power back. But again, this powerful information in the wrong hands can be devastating. And of course, we then got a miscellaneous set of models where anything that really didn't fit into any of those other ones come to me. And then we got these 5 rules of propaganda that come from a very popular book, which we referenced on the website. You can read it. And the gentleman, I think the book was called Europe. And it was really what he identified was there's 5 common rules of propaganda. And when you see them and understand them, have knowledge of them, you'll see them used everywhere. And we've done a video on this as well that people can look at in more in depth. So what we have is all of these models are effectively then interacting with our perception. So these are tools that people with very powerful knowledge can then start to present information in a structured and certain way that then starts to affect our perception.
So you've got people who are trying to control the information and our perception. They're using a combination of these 6 core ways to manipulate people.
Yeah. Yes, and of course, this isn't a exhaustive list. This is really what, on our project we've discovered. A number of these I've known for, some of them for decades. The Mindspace document I only come across, a friend of mine, Catherine, sent it to me. She had got it from a friend. It was very, very powerful to read through how they'd structured this information. But yes, these are really the hows in really what the media does in terms of delivering this information to us. That makes sense? So pretty much content's delivered through these structures and through the various media.
All right.
Now, there's a journalist known as Cheryl Atkinson who's doing some wonderful work. She was I have to say what I think her background is, but you can look at her website for more detail. I think she was a journalist at CBS for over 20 years. She has many awards in journalism and considers herself a real journalist, not just a reporter. There's a very difference there. A journalist will go and research information. When she gets a story, she'll make sure it's true and present it. She won't just get a piece of paper and just read from it, which is what we're seeing a lot today. And she coined a term called astroturfing. And it's really that the resources of some of the large companies on the planet now are so vast that they own lots of the media and newspapers. So it's very hard. Well, in fact, those corporations influence the narrative. And she talks about narratives. And she got to the point where she coined the term called astroturfing, which is really the average member of the public is living in a Truman-esque reality. They don't realize that there's this big gap between them and reality. And that gap, that perception, filter is being conditioned to follow a certain narrative. And she gave one example in the very excellent TED talk that she gave on this subject, in that one company was marketing a product and the consumer of this product, and I don't like that word consumer, when they were sitting at their computer, the company in question literally checked everywhere that person would go to check the information. And then they literally would either buy the company or influence that information. So that person was assuming that they were seeing sort of objective data, but it wasn't true. And what she also showed that meta studies on one of the sites, such as Wikipedia, and you can look at her site for the study on this, that 90% of information on Wikipedia, like medical data, was actually incorrect. And this is the problem, is when we think we're seeing the truth, but in fact, it's someone's opinion and some very powerful people's opinions. And then, of course, with these models that we're going to look at, they can present the information in such an influential way that we're not aware that we're being influenced. And that, I think, the problem, and I think that's the goal of this, is really to put that out there. I don't claim to be, an all-powerful expert on this, but each of these you can look in their own right. That makes sense. So you as the viewer can look at this and go, okay, I'm going to look at this in a bit more detail. And when you see it for yourself, it really begins to make sense. Really, what I'm doing is showing that it exists. So really, well, now we've got a a bit more of a handle on what perception is and how it's so key, then we're going to look at what is the marketing of a problem. So we take our, we could call her Rachel, shall we say? And Rachel's in a predicament. And she's in a predicament because she's been presented with a problem. She's then, and this problem could be a need, an insecurity. She could be self-conscious about things. There could be loads of fear, but there's some problem that's been identified, right? And if you look in women's magazines, the problem will be you're not enough until you buy this product. So this really is the conditioning of a problem. You'll then see that the reaction, this is what, a lot of the time this is presented as how we react to this. And then of course so this is the desire or moving away from the problem. It's the expected conditioned reaction sometimes or often, and it's a movement often towards a solution that suddenly presents itself. We need it, and a lot of people will recognize this throughout the course of history. And of course, then often you've got products, services. This one is what you'll see everywhere. It's the corporation's dream is a compulsory purchase order. When you're forced to buy something from a certain person, that's, the salesman's dream. And of course, you'll notice that a lot of the world now is moving towards a subscription model. Years ago, I bought some bits of software. You could buy them, be £100, $100. Oh, I own that now.
Yeah.
Good luck seeing that now. It's all £20 per month, £10 per month. And of course, you're hooked on. And the amount of people and friends that have signed on to a lot of these, some of them are expensive per month, and they never use them.
Wow.
Yeah, because it's been sold to us in such a way that these subscription models really are the way. And you'll notice for whether it be watching movies or anything else, it's really the most efficient model for them because you've got people just repeat buyers. That's the key.
I think this is, the problem reaction solution thing. I think most people who are going to be watching this are probably quite familiar with seeing this description for a number of reasons. But for anyone who's not familiar with it, I think it's really important to get a head around how this works, because we see this in pretty much, in my opinion, every single big event that happens that we're presented on the media. I often find, if you do a bit of digging, is generally created or manipulated and presented to us in this order. So if they want to get something, if they have an agenda that they want to fulfill, but they don't think the people are going to like it, this is a very effective way to make that happen, right? So you can create a problem, get a reaction from, as you mentioned, the media that they own, so they can control the people's reactions, and then offer the solution to the problem they covertly created.
Yeah. Now, what's interesting about this, because it's very complex at its deeper levels. Now, on the surface level, what you described there has been a lot of people's experience. And on the deeper levels, it doesn't even have to be, it can still be true. But it could be one case. And one case wouldn't be warrant enough to have a reaction or solution. But if that one case is then plastered across the media 24/7, what happens is it takes on it's not one tiny instance in a big sea of events. It's then portrayed as, oh, this is a massive event. So what you'll see is that some things that have occurred over the last few decades have actually gone down in incident, but the reporting's gone up like 100 times. So suddenly we feel like there's a massive problem. But in fact, it's actually been getting better. So the perception of the portrayal of this is so key. So you could, when you really see how these things work at a deep level, can people really convince anyone of anything? It makes you wonder with what we've seen over the last 18 months. So yeah, this is a model that a lot of people will see. And of course, what you'll find is that these influence factors are really how they create and define the problem, how they create the reaction, and how they create the solution. It's that how that's the key question today. So if we now look at these influence factors, we've got, as we looked at them, we've got a list of these. So we've got the Mindspace documents. That's the 9 elements within there to influence people. You've got the 7 laws of influence. That's a body of work from Cialdini and the Behavioral Insights team. You've got NLP, and this really, at its core bit, is the knowledge of subjective experience. Then you've got language patterns and lots of language models. And there's 2 key ones, which are the Meta and the Milton model, and they're mentioned a lot within NLP. You've got the 5 rules of propaganda, and you've got this miscellaneous collection. So what we're doing, we're going to touch into each of these. So I'm going to show you the factors that exist that we've identified in these models, and then we're going to look at a couple of examples. And we have already done some videos, particularly on the Mindspace document. We've done one on the 5 rules of propaganda, and we've done some on the language patterns. These are kind of important. And a point is that many of these overlap. There's not really this neat fitting together. So you'll see, for instance, the Mindspace document has 9 elements. You've got the 7 laws of influence, but 3 or 4 of those are actually in the Mindspace document. That makes sense. You'll see this real overlap. So let's look at Mindspace first of all. Now, this is a fairly controversial document, and here's the front page. And as you can see, they're saying influencing behavior through public policy. And then you can see by, this drawing of the brain, and these are the elements within it.
So this is actually a government document.
This is a government document. You can find this document. There is a link. We've made a video on this document. Summary. It's a big doc. It's like 100 pages. It's quite in depth. And you can find that we do have a link on the video to where you can see this document. So you can pop that in the link to this interview. Yeah. And here's page 66. So on the left is the front page, and then on the right is a quote from page 66, which is really the ethical question. So you see there where it says automatic effects may raise charges of manipulation. Yes, I think we all acknowledge that. So what they're really saying here is, look at the bit halfway down. People tend to think that attempts to change their behavior will be effective if they are simply provided information in an above board way. People have a strong dislike of being tricked. This dislike is a psychological grounding, but fundamentally is an issue of trust in government. And of course, there's other bits where they talk about this. So they know that a lot of the information that's in this particular document is actually changing people's behavior without their knowledge. That's when it becomes obviously that big ethical question. Again, it's up to the viewer to decide that. I made a video on this. My opinion I stated was, I don't think this document is ethical, but that's my opinion. And I think everyone, I think we're still entitled to our own opinions. But on some levels, I can understand that the information could be used for good. For instance, you could use a lot of this information to help people be healthier. So much of people's exposure to environment, but of course, that's not been one of the big goals of this. And here's page 67. Now, this really was quite concerning. So it says, people may feel government is affecting their personality. So it says impact on personal identity. So really they're acknowledging that a lot of this information, and as we see when we looked at, remember that mirror, is that a lot of these factors can actually get people to see themselves in a different light. Now, this is obviously very, very key. One or two of them we'll look at really will change people's view of themselves, but they won't be aware that they've changed how they view themselves. And that's obviously very concerning. So on one level, I feel this information is important to have knowledge of so we can protect our personal identities, because that's really key. So the Mindspace, really adjusting behavior through public policy. So these are the 9 elements that are in Mindspace. This is the summary that's within the document. I say we did a video on this, looking at it in a bit more detail. And what I'm going to do on the next slide is we're going to take one of these and look at it as an example. Okay, so let's look at our example and let's look at what we're going to say. So the problem that was identified here is the NHS is overrun. People may react against the NHS. So they had a key thing, and we're looking at the commitment principle here, which is a very powerful principle that was identified in the 7 laws of influence originally and is in the Mindspace document. And the commitment principle says that if you can get someone to make a small, minor commitment, then they will shift how they view themselves, and then they'll be behind that idea. Wow. There was a very powerful study that originated in California where they would visit a set of residents and they would ask them, would you like to put this big sign in your garden? It was a big, ugly sign that says, please drive carefully. The compliance, I do believe, and people can check the book to check the exact numbers, I believe it was 17%, which is obviously a very low compliance. They then went to a different set of residents. They had them sign a petition. So all they wanted was a signature. And the signature was just to say, I support safe driving laws. It was something like that. They went back to those same people 2 weeks later, and they said, can we put this sign in your front garden? The compliance went from 17% I believe, up to 76%.
Wow, that's insane.
Which is absolutely insane. And what they theorize is that the people that sign in have changed their self-image to support that notion. Then when someone presents them in future. So we have the example here that I think the people worked out that it was important that people didn't push against the NHS, that they were supporting it for the various things that were going on. So what they did was they devised this clap into the sky on a Thursday night. Looks rather harmless, and I have no absolute proof that this is why they did it, but it seems a huge coincidence that it really forms the commitment principle. So once people are out there clapping on Thursday night, then they're in support of the NHS. So then they're going to be really behind it. Then anyone that didn't do it, as you noticed, was chastised for not doing so. So it was really get behind the NHS. So you can see the problem, reaction, solution was, you know, how they managed this. Now, in some instances, that could be, you know, people could argue that's a fairly okay use of it. I'm not so sure. I think that, you know, the government really has to be a lot more careful of ethics than than a singular person, because when any authorization, when any sort of organization has a lot of power, they obviously have to be a lot more careful. And then I'll share a personal story how this principle was used in a positive use. So I was talking to a gentleman at a park, and he had a lot of illnesses and symptoms going on. And I've had a lot of involvement in research in radiation frequency radiation, which from the, you know, around what they're doing with all the mobile phones, etc. And I kind of, it reminded me a lot of the studies I'd read. So I said to them, you know, why don't you just try one minor inconvenient step that might help? He said, what's that? I said, well, just switch your Wi-Fi off at night. Okay, little commitment. Anyway, I bumped into a couple of weeks later, and he said it changed his health completely. He realized that he was actually really sensitive to these things, to the point where he now switched his phone onto airplane mode, and he really protected himself, and his health's been improving since. But if I'd have said to him, you know, get rid of phones, do all these things, it would have been too strong, too much. So the commitment principle was really just take one step. So it can be used in a very powerful thing, particularly with children. You can really encourage children. You can really get them to do little things and then build and build and build. So the principle itself is just a natural thing that occurs. We have to be very respectful to it, and we can use it in very powerful ways. However, it can also be used to start to condition whole bodies of population without their knowledge. And of course, what happens is that this is one of the actual principles that people will start to change their self-image. So it's not really changing their, well, it is changing their perception of the outside world, but it's also changing their perception of themselves, which is kind of key. So then that brings us on to, and of course that document, say that's readily available from a government website. You can also watch the video that the summary of it. So then we got into the 7 laws of influence. Now this is a powerful body of work, and there's 7 laws, and 3 of them actually overlap with the Mindspace document. And this body of work was really picked up by the whole marketing sector. It really, you know, there was marketing department, anyone that you'll talk to in marketing and sales will likely have heard of this body of work. And if we look at one of the laws of influence, which is scarcity, now this one you would have seen a lot of. If one thing that isn't scarce is use of the scarcity principle. So really scarcity drives an increase in desire or value for a limited resource if it's feeling that it's limited. So what you would have seen is literally about every product pretty much over the last 2 years and for decades is there's only so many XXX. So replace that X with anything. Okay, and I'm going to stay away from being specific so we have less chance of being censored. But effectively, you'll see this constantly. So the problem is, oh, there's only so limited. So then what does that do? That drives up the increased desire for XXX. And then, of course, when it finally you get to see, oh, there's some available, you feel a real desire or need to buy XXX or have XXX before it runs out. It's been used so extensively that it's really a surprise. And what's fascinating about this that when I spoke to people, whichever side of the narrative they're on, if there are sides, and we assume that there's two sides, but there's many sides, everyone agrees that this is going on. So some of these, pointing these out, are really a way for us to connect, no matter what our belief systems are. That makes sense. I think that calling this game out is very useful. This one, for me, is an unethical use. Okay. If something is in scarcity, then fine, you can make that note. But if it's not, I don't use this. I don't like all that clickbaiting and all those things. For me, this is it, and you want it or not. To create this illusion of scarcity feels disingenuous. It makes sense. Whereas a commitment principle, I could understand how that might be used positively. So it's really for the viewer to discern themselves. And then we get onto the NLP tools. And I think it really is worth mentioning again. I mean, I was actually a licensed NLP practitioner myself. I didn't feel the need to get into it really depth because I saw that there was areas on the practical side that could be manipulative. And I think the majority of the people within NLP are good-natured. So, but it gets a bad name. And it gets a bad name because some people are really pointing out how it's being used badly and, to manipulate people. And it's really those people using it that are the problem. So some of the NLP factors, and there's many of them, but some of them that I've just identified here that are really key is one of them is the meta programs. Now that effectively is that, and I'll select one, which is the moving away from or moving towards. So we have habits, and we generally will have, if you looked at an individual person, you could profile that person into slightly different habits. A lot of people will move away from something, while others will move towards something. Okay, so in the Mindspace document, they know this, so they know that the majority of people move away from avoiding losses. So much of the narrative will be, do this or you lose that. Do this or this will happen. Yeah, so it's really scaring them. And of course, fear is, we've not mentioned this specifically, but fear is the currency of control. So get someone into that fearful state. They can't be rational because they're being emotional, etc. The map is not the territory. We touched on this earlier. That's really understanding how perception works, and that perception itself is a layer between us and reality. We've got this thing called neurological levels. We go into this on some other things. I won't touch on it here, but it's really breaking down the ego to a large extent and how we function with the maps of ourselves, which is just, again, it's just a natural process. Metaphors are really key because metaphors effectively, a lot of people will say, is how we think about things. So a lot of time we're thinking through metaphors. A lot of metaphors have been provided for us the last 18 months, 2 years, and they can become very powerful because once we have knowledge of a metaphor, we tend to own it and then think through it. A lot of the metaphors on this project we've provided, we've either got them from other experts or we've created them in order to allow people to see something at a much greater or clearer level. Stories we touched on. Stories are so powerful. The information will land so much better if it's in a story. Presuppositions. Now, this is actually a language pattern, but we've pulled it out because specifically it's so powerful. If I said to you, Jamie, oh, when are you going to get XXX? Yeah, then what's the presupposition? Presuppositions, you're going to get it. Presuppositions is that it must be good for you, it must be safe, all these things. Now, now that is actually the structure that a lot of, particularly one of the main corporations in the UK that's involved in media, that anyone that's aware of anything would not watch, they ran an article that said, when is it your turn to get it? Now, think about that. So turn is almost like, oh, it's a gift and all these things. So the language is so powerful.
That also incorporates social proof in a way as well, because it's also, kind of giving you the impression that, oh, everyone else is doing this.
Yes. And there's one very knowledgeable person on this subject, and he was working with a friend of mine, and one of the texts that went out from an organization to people, he broke it down and showed how 6 or 7 or 8 of these factors were actually ticked in one text, not accidentally. It's not like someone sending you a text, just randomly. People have sat down in departments, in boardrooms with lots of psychologists working out how to phrase that. And of course, the language patterns are very key, because once you understand how all this works, and if you get even just a little bit of knowledge on this, then you can start asking really powerful questions. You can be very effective in disabling a lot of this if it's not in our best interests. So that's really the NLP side of things. And then and obviously I'm aware this could be quite depth, but the beauty of it being recorded, people can stop and watch and look at other elements, is that then we've got the 5 rules of propaganda. And we did a presentation on this a few weeks ago. And I found this information was really key. So if we look at it, what you'll find with a lot of propaganda is that it simplifies. So basically it says this or that. So you could define the problem as being, there's this really terrible thing that you mustn't get because it might be dangerous. And then here's the solution, take this and you'll be fine. That's really a simplification. If other treatments that are very effective come into the picture, it's no longer simple for the person. So those other treatments often will be dismissed or censored, etc., etc. And that's really the simplification. So people want it, a lot of people think in either or situations. So this is why through propaganda, they really simplify the message. It's very much with the war message as well, you'll notice. Dr. Colin Alexander did a brilliant presentation on this a few weeks ago, and he was showing, the propaganda of fear. So yeah, it's very effective. So we've got simplification, then we've got disfiguration. And this is what you'll see. Anyone that opposes the problem, reaction, solution is then discredited with crude smears and parodies. So what you'll find is that, somebody will propose a solution. And if we say that might not be the best solution, suddenly we're anti-solution. Okay.
It's crazy the language they use as well. They check things like, their bizarre statements or their crazy outlook,
Yeah, well, we took a look at this when we looked at the 5 rules of propaganda. There's certain buzzwords you'll notice. So it's, it's all the, it's so common language that they use, and they're just, yeah, you're right, bizarre, strange, vile, all these things just really discrediting that person. There's no, well, it's sensible to ask a question. If you push against the movement, you're going to get discredited. This is how propaganda works. You then get transfusion. Now this, I think, is the most complex to understand, but actually once you understand it, it's probably the most powerful that's used against us. Transfusion is using someone's belief system and values against themselves. So most people don't want to be selfish. So if you tell them they're selfish for not doing what you want them to do, that's transfusion. Now we're seeing a lot of that. This virtual signals, this guilt on people, blah, blah, blah. I've watched the BBC, so I know what I'm talking about. You need to do this. It's like, well, I read 70 studies on it. We talk about, no, yourself. Doesn't make any logical sense, but that's what transfusions. The next one really is presenting one's viewpoint as if it was unanimous. So the beauty of censorship from their perspective, the ones guiding the media, that you can present this as having consensus. So what you'll notice over the last 2 years is that people, the constant thing I bang up against when I'm talking to people, when I want an open and honest conversation, oh, there's scientific consensus. And I'm like, whoa, there is nothing of the sort. Like, you couldn't be further from the truth in that statement. But if you only see in one side of the picture, you don't know the other side exists. So that's where censorship has become so powerful. And of course, it's a dictator's dream is to silence the opposition. And then the last one is orchestration. So this is the endlessly repeating the same message in different variations, combinations. What you'll notice is pretty much every channel you'll watch, every newspaper will have the same slant on the narrative. I remember decades ago when you'd read something, they'd have opposing views. You don't see that anymore.
Yeah. This for me, this list here is the most powerful one. I think this is really powerful stuff.
Yeah, well, we did a video on this, and the book's got great reviews, and I think the gentleman did a wonderful job. And I think what I've done is really just looked at it at the summary level, and it really, knowing what I know about how perception and all this works, I was like, wow, this is powerful. It's such a good summary, isn't it? Like 5 things, you get to see what they're doing. So then we've got miscellaneous. And what we got here is just a collection of a few things that don't really fit into the other things. So we've got normalization, and that's very key. The new, remember that? Basically, if you can normalize some strange behaviors being normal, then everyone's readily accepted it, obviously for the social proof, etc. So the normalization is really key and important not to accept. I noticed that I would visit a country quite regular. I won't mention which country, but I'm sure everyone will know which country it is that's portraying a police state. I used to live there, and I would visit there once I left every couple of years. And I noticed every couple of years this real shift in sort of moving towards really like a police state. And I was like, wow, this really isn't comfortable. But those living on a daily basis, it's like looking at yourself in the mirror every day. You won't notice the change. But suddenly someone doesn't see you for 5 years and they're going to notice the changes. So this is that normalization. This is the boiling of the frog.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thinking of it.
Yeah. Just if it happens so slowly, then we've got a mission. Now, this is actually really key. I was reviewing one of the documents that's, I mean, I can't say much about it, but it's a shocking document. And it's littered with propaganda, coercive manipulation, just every technique in the book. Now, one of the key things about this document is what it didn't say. Okay, anything against its argument, it literally pretended didn't exist. It was trying to portray itself as, you know, as balanced view, but it was anything but. So what you'll notice is what's not said is actually really key. You've then got this pictorial messaging. Now, those that like some of the magicians, they know how powerful this is. A lot of the mind magicians will do this. They'll have pictures in the background influencing people's behavior without realizing it. So when you read some of the media articles online, start to have a look at the picture and what the picture's inferring next to the title of the piece or any of the body. We've got misdirection. That's the classic magician's trick. Now, of course, sometimes we'll be deep in an issue, then suddenly, you know, some massive issue happens and everything else is forgotten. We have a limited capacity by which to hold things in mind. And this last one, which I'm really just going to only touch on today because it has a lot of depth to it, funny enough, by the description of it, but it's what's known as the illusion of explanatory depth. Now, what this is that when we think about how the media gives us information nowadays, what usually would happen is we'd build up lots of information by which to then make conclusions. And then, you know, if we've done that through experience and well-researched and, you know, based on facts, we're going to have some pretty solid conclusions. What's going on now is that people are given conclusions. They're given conclusions by the media, but they have no substance to them. So what happens is that this is known as the illusion of explanatory depth. So you ask someone a question. So I was somewhere recently and someone shouted, "Oh, you're spreading misinformation." So I went up to them politely and said, "Okay, but always possible, you know, never defend, you know, you don't have the truth defends itself." So I said, "What misinformation am I spreading?" So there's this pause because he suddenly realizes it's the illusion of explanatory depth. He's standing on his soapbox shouting his belief systems, but he doesn't know that the soapbox is empty.
Yeah, right.
So then I said to him, so then he just said, "Oh, you're spreading misinformation." I said, "Yes, I heard you, but you have to tell me what misinformation." And I said, "Do you know why we're here?" And because I followed the do's and don'ts, we then had, you know, the other, you know, there was 3 of them. Then I had a 30-minute conversation with this guy where he had to keep nodding in agreement because he had just seen me as, you know, crazy person, etc. And that's because this illusion of explanatory depth. I would say that the amount of people walking around in this country, around the world now, with conclusions that are based on things that they think is fact, but once you question them, they realize it's a house of cards, is why this term is so key.
That's a really powerful one, because what you're saying, I guess, is people have been spoon-fed things to chuck at certain groups, right? Or
Yes.
Yeah, there's no substance to it.
Yeah, they've been told what to think. And of course, when you start questioning them, why they arrived at that conclusion, they realize they don't know. And that's really a lot of time they experience cognitive dissonance. And that's where we have to be very supportive. I mean, there's a lot of arseholes out there at the moment, you know what I mean? And there's a lot of people, you know, spouting stuff. But I know that we can't get through to those people if we call them arseholes, or really the way they're acting is like an arsehole. So this is why, you know, I do take the sort of soft and gentle approach in trying to reach people so they can see the errors of their thinking. We've all have errors of thinking. So it's really important to analyze that. And if this person is supported well enough to see the error of their ways, most people apologize.
You know, you're such a shining example of that, David. I find you very inspiring, actually, because I think most of us in this reality, in this sort of trying to help change the world for the better, when we try and give someone information and we're met with resistance, I think we can often take it personally, because we identify with you know what we believe is right, or we identify with trying to be a good person. So
thank you, Jamie, because
question you can get annoyed.
Yes, exactly. Now, there's the thing is, everything that people experience in this, I've experienced it probably more than most. But the thing is, I jumped in at the deep end and really got involved in this. And made mistake after mistake, and by mistake said something that didn't reach the other person. Yeah. So it's not like it, you know, it might have been 100% factual, but the real key is, how do I get an idea from one mind into the other? So that, and really for me, it's pointing at the truth, but it's pointing at the truth in such an effective way that the person go, well, actually, yeah, that does make sense. But if I scream at them or I get annoyed with them, they can't look at it. So the way to do that, I feel, is that, you know, treat people's mind with real delicateness, because it is. They've been under biggest psyops in history. You know, have a bit of compassion. Some people have done some pretty horrific things. Those that realize what they've done, they got to live with that. You know, there's some that don't care. They're the evil ones. But, you know, when it all comes out, I mean, there's a lot of us that can say, well, we did what we thought was right, you know, and then there's going to be other people that are really going to have to face up to what they've done, you know, and that's not going to be pleasant. So that's where I kind of come from, that, you know, try to empathize as much as we can. No, I'm not, you know, I'm no saint or angel by that means. You know, people can trigger me, but I just get triggered a lot less than I used to, because I'm well aware what triggers me now. So I deal with it. You know, I go through certain techniques and processes in order to make sure that I have less buttons to press. So if we look just as I think we've got through a lot there, Jamie. I feel like it flowed well into the sense of, you know, when we look at a summary of these, you know, looking at them, it's really that you could spend, you know, a lot of time on each of these. And I think there's a real benefit in just the knowledge of them. And then people can look at which ones they feel are useful. I think these language ones would be very powerful. I mean, I'd love to have a group of people, you know, particularly, you know, those in the activists that want to do good, have good intentions, to really show them how this works at a deep level, so then they can really start, you know, imagine having a group of people that could take the media apart and spot all the things and have like a daily upload in the propaganda. It would lose its power.
And if we can all do that for our families and friends as well, and, you know, show people actually this is kind of how you've been coerced into thinking a certain way, this is how you've been duped into identifying with this. I mean, you know, it's not always easy to get facts across to people, but that's still pretty powerful.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there's a lady I know, Val, and she's doing some brilliant work at one of the big groups, and she, you know, said it. She said, call the game out. And I thought, yeah, you know, you call the game out, then, you know, people know they're being played. You know, there's some powerful, you know, doctors in the US that have made videos, you know, we're being played. It's a delicate subject, because, as Mark Twain said, it's easier to fool someone than convince them they're being fooled. So that really is a delicate process of going through that. And
yeah, I mean, it's almost a direct attack on someone's intelligence, really, isn't it? But
it is, and it can feel that way. And that's why, you know, I firstly try to make someone feel that what, you know, point out what they're doing well, you know, initially, you know, really recognize. Because I think, you know, one of the points is there's a lot of things in those of us that want to make a positive impact. You know, that intention, you got that intention, I'll help anyone that has that intention. And I think there's some things that we really need to acknowledge. We're under a lot of stress and overwhelm and all these things going on, and really to start to address that at first, and then get onto all the other things. So I guess open it up, Jamie, if you have any questions or general observations you'd like to voice.
No, I think you've covered pretty much everything there. I think just a sort of general observation for I think the whole thing was really very empowering from 2 points. You know, it's really nice to be able to spot and smell the BS a bit easier, and to help other people see that. And I think what you've given us there, the information you've given us there is really empowering in that sense. It's going to be a lot easier to read a headline in a newspaper, or even a leaflet that comes through the door giving us guidance on how we should do something. But also, yeah, you've got some great tools there that we can use. And I think one of the things we have to do is, you know, I know you say you don't like use the word war, but we are in a bit of a battle here. And I think we can use the systems that have been so heavily researched by the people who are working against us, and we can use those tools to, you know, empower ourselves in this mission of ours.
Yeah, there is a lot of truth in that. And I find that, you know, I'm talking to some organizations and they're using literally the law itself to push back on these things. So, you know, I think that is the key. As I mentioned earlier, I think intention is a big part of it. You know, I forgive anyone if they have good intention. What I don't like is when someone intentionally manipulates me for their gain.
Yes.
Therapists see clients and their job is to influence them for the client's gain. Okay, now that's when using these influence techniques, where a lot of them originated, is fine. It's in that setting. Then if someone's using it for their gain, then obviously then manipulation starts to flash in flash.
In a previous life, I was a car salesman, and you can imagine some of the training I was given. I wasn't very comfortable with it, if I'm honest. But I think most of the people in the activist world, I think it's important that we come from a place of integrity. For me, that's my #1 core value. And I think if we all stand by that, then utilizing the information that you've given us here, you've dispensed for us, you know, it can be a really amazing thing.
Excellent. So yeah, we'll wrap it up there. I think I felt like, you know, getting this out is key. You know, I make the point again, we have got limited resources, so we're just trying to get the substance out there. You know, if there's people out there, and I have been contacted by a few, want to start packaging this in more sort of graphical ways, then brilliant. You know, because it's
cool.
And you know, as we spoke about earlier, it's really just people having the choice, you know, having informed consent, being kept in the light, all these things.
And we can find some more information on this on your website, reachingpeople.website.
Yes, and I think what we can do is we've made various videos on these, so we can put the links obviously on this video when it gets uploaded, and people can find their way around the various other presentations to look at it in a little bit more depth.
Amazing. Cool. Thanks, David. So guys, check out what David's up to. Incredible guy, really empowering information, and this guy's so dedicated to helping us out and helping us understand how to effectively reach people and understand how we've been manipulated. Check out his work a little bit more. Incredible stuff. Thanks, David. Cheers.
Thank you, Jamie. It's been an honor, and I'll speak to you soon. Ciao.